This conference will now be recorded.
Meetings of the Richmond Regional District Planning District Commissions have transitioned to a virtual format. Regional public bodies were granted authority to conduct meetings electronically pursuant to the provisions of Virginia Code Section 2.2-37082 and related legislation approved by the General Assembly of Virginia during the period of the governor's state of emergency declaration for COVID-19. While we do not know the exact duration of the current practice of electronic meetings, we will continue to function in this manner until such time as it is deemed appropriate to return to in-person meetings. Staff provided notice of this meeting and the means by which we are virtually gathered to members of the public on September 3rd, 2020, through electronic posting on the Plan RVA website and email distribution of notice to members, alternates, and known interested parties, including the media. This meeting will be recorded. Audio and visual recordings of the meeting and materials will be posted on the Plan RVA website within 48 hours of this meeting. Any member of the public participating as an observer during the meeting today may submit comments or questions at any time during the meeting by email via email at rrtpoinput@planrva.org or by using the online chat functions of the meeting platform. Those individuals who are observing by phone may be called upon to share questions or comments. This meeting agenda includes opportunities. This meeting actually doesn't, because this is just the kickoff, but future meetings will include opportunities for members of the public to address the body. All comments and questions submitted during the meeting will be reviewed following the meeting, and to the extent practical, responses will be provided or posted on the Plan RVA website. We ask that everyone identify themselves first when speaking so we can more accurately record the activities of the meeting. All lines have been muted by the meeting administrator to minimize additional noise and feedback. You may unmute your line at any time to request acknowledgement from the chair. Staff will be monitoring the chat functions throughout the meeting to assure we do not overlook anyone wishing to participate as appropriate in the discussion. Does anyone have questions regarding the process for assuring effective facilitation of this meeting or how members of the public may participate? Okay. So we did actually give Nicole a bit of a break, so she doesn't have to sit through this meeting. So instead of Nicole certifying, I will go ahead and certify that we have followed the appropriate procedures for notice of the meeting and means by which we are convening. I worked with Nicole on that, so we can go ahead and certify. So the first thing we need to do is take the roll call. Please indicate your presence by saying aye when your name is called during a roll call. Anyone who wishes to identify themselves following the roll call members will be invited to do so. First, for Goochland, we have Mr. Coleman.
Aye.
For GRTC, we have Ms. Del Ross.
Aye.
For Hanover County, we have Mr. Vidunas.
Aye.
For Henrico, we have Ms. Smidler.
Aye.
And then for the city of Richmond, I believe Mr. Bridewell is attending.
Aye.
Okay. And then we have two non-voting members. For DRPT, we have Ms. Dubinsky.
Aye.
And for VDOT, Ms. McAdory.
Aye.
Great. So we have our quorum. So the first item on the agenda today is selecting a chair and vice chair for this subcommittee. It is going to be more informal. Our intent is just to run most business by consensus, but we do need somebody to get us through the agenda each month when we meet. So do I have any nominations or volunteers for the chair?
I nominate Tom Coleman.
All right.
Nominate Joe Vidunas.
Do we have a second on either of those nominations?
I'll second. I was going to second the first one. Can I second if I'm not non-voting? I can't second, can
I?
Liz, that's kind of the beauty of being non-voting.
Yeah, I mean, never mind. I'm going to mute myself and just sit back and relax.
Well, it sounds like we have two nominations, so if one of you wants to step up for chairman and the other can take the vice chairman position, I think we'd be able to move forward and just take a vote to get that selection out of the way. So again, this is going to be relatively, I think it's 4 meetings in total we have scheduled on the tentative schedule right now. So this shouldn't be a big time commitment from anyone who wants to be the chair for this.
Can we be co-chairs?
Sure. I think that we did that with the LRTP as well. So yeah, I think we could do co-chairs. So since we have agreement between those two, I guess we can say you both seconded and made the motion on that one. We're going to go through the roll call vote, and it's just the 5 voting members, so this should be quick. So Goochland County, Mr. Coleman, how do you vote?
Aye.
Okay. GRTC, Ms. Del Ross.
Aye.
Hanover County, Mr. Vidunas.
Aye.
Henrico County, Ms. Smidler.
Aye.
And City of Richmond, Mr. Bridewell.
Aye.
Perfect. Okay. So congratulations, our co-chairs. If you'd like, I can continue for this meeting and then you can take over for the next meeting, or that's probably the easiest since you didn't have any time to prepare since you weren't aware of it.
Thank you, Joe and Tom and Miles.
So I'll go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint now that we're getting into the meat of this meeting. Okay. Can everyone see the screen?
Yep, can see it.
Yes.
Okay. So the first item on the agenda is just a little bit of background. So we're all starting from a common understanding of where the program's at and the reasons we're undertaking this update. So just as I'm sure you're all aware, but there's 2 main funding sources that we work with. So there's the Surface Transportation Program, the RSTPG, as we're calling it now, which is a very flexible source of funding. It can cover a wide range of projects. And this is the bigger pot. It's about $20 million each year that we have to allocate. The second program is our CMAQ, that's Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality. It's much more limited. It's only available to localities and agencies within the former non-attainment area under the 1997 8-hour ozone standards. So it doesn't include everyone, and it is more limited. The projects can only be specific types, essentially, that will improve air quality. So those are the 2 main sources that we work with. A little bit of background, both of these funds date back to the early 1990s with ICE-T. So this represented a big transition in transportation funding, whereas previously it had been kind of given out by population. This was more local control over the funding sources. The MPO oversees the allocations. We're responsible for tracking the funding in coordination with DRPT and VDOT, obviously. And then we're also responsible for selecting the projects, and that's the main role that these guidelines help us to fulfill. So a little background on the TPO's use of the funds. During the 1990s and early 2000s, our funding was largely based on population. So we'd get projects and we'd kind of distribute it to make sure it was matching up with the share of population. So the bigger localities got more of the money. Essentially, that wasn't allowed under changes to regulations. So the regulations around the TIP basically say you can't just sub-allocate to jurisdictions. There has to be some sort of selection process. So in 2004, TAC went through this process and came up with the guidelines that we have today. The methodology that we chose to adopt was largely borrowed from Hampton Roads. So Hampton Roads had developed the criteria back in 1992 when these funds first became available. And they'd made some revisions, but essentially we adopted Hampton Roads' policies and methodology wholesale. So we've had several revisions to our program over the years. The biggest changes or most important changes are shifting the number of years that we're allocating. So we went from 3 years to 4 years to 6 years, basically moving from a TIP time period to the SIP. And the second piece was the allocations for Ride Finder. So the baseline is now set at 500,000 for each year. So those have been the main changes. Other than that, we haven't done much in the way of revision to the program. The document does need to be updated and reviewed. So there's old references throughout the document. It refers to RAMPO. That's the old name for the organization. There's a lot of dated language, such as using accident versus crashed, and it's just not the way we talk about transportation issues anymore. And then, as I mentioned before, the criteria that we're using was developed by Hampton Roads in 1992. So it's nearly 30 years old. There's been a lot of changes in the transportation world in that time. So we want to take a look at the whole program and not just pieces of it at this time. Some other elements that we think really need to come into play this time: alternative funding opportunities. So when this was first set up, we didn't have Smart Scale, we didn't have the CVTA. There's a lot more money available for these types of projects now in our region. So finding a way to leverage the funds that we have for RSTP and CMAQ against those other sources, or to help make sure that we're selecting projects that are most appropriately sized in terms of cost for the pot of money that we have, I think are things we'll need to look at. The other piece of it is there are a lot of evolving transportation priorities. A lot of this is coming down from the federal government, such as the resiliency and climate change. That's now something we have to factor in for our long-range planning. But there's other issues that have come up in the region. We have a Vision Zero work group now that's just getting kicked off, but it's something that we need to consider with our project scoring. Equity has been a growing concern in the region and nationally. So looking at how equitable our distribution of funds and project selections are. So these are some concerns that have come up over time that really aren't addressed by the guidance that we have today. So for all of these reasons, we think that it's time to go ahead and look at the whole program and start updating. So I'm going to pause here now that we've gone through the background and listen to any questions or any feedback that you have.
This is Sharon with Henrico, and I totally agree with what you're saying about leveraging the funds, with Smart Scale and CVTA, and even if it's, one to start PE, and then that helps get, Smart Scale funding and stuff like that. So I think that's a great idea.
This is Joe Vidunas. I have a question about the current transportation bill that I believe is set to expire on September 30th. And this program and other programs are dependent. So this program, if it's not renewed or a new bill is not passed, this would be paused or potentially terminated. We don't think that's going to happen, but is that what we're looking at?
Yeah, I think the general understanding is this would just be continued on until they can reach a broader agreement. I think that's generally the approach that the government has taken on that side. But yes, in theory, I guess if there was no continuing resolution, no way to move these programs forward into the next fiscal year, it could drop off until we had a new set of funding. And Chet, it looks like you wanted to weigh in too.
I was just going to say, I would be shocked if they didn't just do a continuing resolution. I mean, that's kind of the normal practice now, because no one can agree on anything for reauthorization. So yeah, I haven't heard anything to the contrary. Just for this group's information, the CTAC is getting a federal update next week, next Thursday, from AMPO as part of their meeting. So I encourage anyone who wants to hear kind of from the lobbyist's mouth what's going on Capitol Hill to tune in for that. But yeah, Joe, I wouldn't be too worried about funding going away. Just kick the can down the road.
Any other questions on the kind of the background information of these programs? Okay. So we'll move on then. So this was next section. This was presented at TAC, but this is kind of the areas that staff has already identified as some of the key focuses as we go through our update. So the first one is moving towards a unified scoring process. So with this new LRTP that we're working on, this is kind of our first move towards data-driven performance-based planning. So we're really developing metrics that for each project we can say, this is where it was before, this is what the project will do, and we can give it a score and evaluate. Very similar to how Smart Scale evaluates projects. As we move towards that, it makes a lot of sense for us to also move our funding programs towards that same scoring. So Hampton Roads made this move in 2009. They switched over to performance-based planning, and it was actually some of the foundation for what became SmartScale. And they now use that for their RSTP program. They've also now moved on to adding transit and bike ped. So originally it was just highway, but public transportation and bike ped projects are all being scored consistently from the long range plan through their RSTP process. We think this would make a lot of sense for us to do. It would create consistent scoring and prioritization across all of our work. We would still need to come up with some alternative scorings for studies and some programs, ongoing funding. But for most projects, I think we would be able to use the same scoring that we developed with the LRTP. So this is one of the focus areas that we would like to explore as part of this process. The second is transportation alternatives, including them in our guidelines. So right now, the TA program, we have no guidance that's been adopted by TAC or the TPO that gives us a direction on how we want to use those funds. So for RSTP and CMAQ, we have specified details of, CMAQ should be used for regionally significant projects, or RSTP should be used for leveraging where possible. For TA, we don't have that same direction. We think it would be helpful. I've heard a lot, especially over this last round, of competing visions of how TA funds should be used. And, whether it should be used for projects that can't get funded through other sources, should it be used for projects that are maximizing equity and distribution towards communities that most benefit from non-motorized modes. So I think including the guidelines for this program in with our RSTP and CMAQ makes sense. It's all one regional pot of funding that we're distributing and overseeing. So it makes a lot of sense, especially now that TA is essentially a subset of RSTP. So the way it works at the distribution level, it's like 10% off of the top of the STBG funds. So I think the way that works, the way that we're handling it, it should all be included in our guidelines. The third area we've kind of hit on briefly already. Oh, Liz, did you want to weigh in?
My only concern about lumping them together, and it's not even really a concern, I just wanted to remind that there's a 20% local match to all the TAP. I don't think it necessarily changes the game, just wanted to make sure everyone remembered that.
Yeah. And a lot of the TA program is really administered through VDOT. So it would be more of just helping us to get to guidance on how we're selecting our projects that we want to. So even though they're submitted and largely scored through VDOT side, we just want to make sure we have some direction at the staff level. So this third one is the leveraging. I think what it really comes down to, and I think Sharon hit on this already, the guidelines encourage leveraging, but we don't really have a detailed, this is how we do it. So if we're just going to do PE for funds that are intended to leverage, we should have that spelled out somewhere that if a project is intended for leveraging, we'll give you the first phase that you need funding for, and then you can use that to go forward. We also need to discuss concepts like what happens if you are unsuccessful in getting the SmartScale funding or CVTA funding for the rest of the project. So I think some of that still needs to be fleshed out. We don't have any guidance really at the staff level, so we'd like to get that. Especially since the sources of funding from SmartScale and CVTA are huge compared to what we have each year. The fourth item is refining our allocation guidance. So this is kind of a follow-up on the conversations we've been having at TAC regarding allocations. Our guidelines basically give us an order of allocations. We do existing projects first, then we do the new projects. But we don't really have an adopted TPO approach. What are we keeping in the balance entry? What is our philosophy in terms of spreading out the funding over a certain number of years and matching the schedules? So all of those details, we can put it in the document, and this will make it more transparent. Anyone who's getting funding can pretty much predict how the funding will be broken down, and it'll make it easier for the public as well to understand how we're putting money on projects. The other piece of this is guidance for transfers, changing schedules. We have guidance that was adopted somewhat separately, so I think consolidating it in the same document of this is how we're handling transfers makes a lot of sense. It's just going to be one go-to resource for regional funding on projects. And then the fifth staff identified focus area is improving our project delivery and tracking, and I think this one's a big one. We looked at the projects that have been submitted and selected since 2010, and we've had an average of 35% cost overrun from the initial estimate to whatever the project actually finished at, or where it is today for some that aren't completed yet. So looking at those numbers, obviously we're not doing a great job of getting our initial estimates in. The other piece of that is when you look at our TIP, we're not obligating those funds as scheduled and planned in the TIP. So improving our schedules and our cost estimates on the front end, I think, is a big piece to improving the project delivery. The other component of this that we'd like to explore would be moving towards more reporting. So right now we do those annual meetings. At the end of each application cycle, we meet with you, talk about where all the projects are. But making it easy for you to just give us an update, fill it out online, quick, here's what task we're on. Here's any areas we're seeing potential cost overruns, anything like that, to speed it up and make sure that we have accurate information throughout the year so we can better assess ahead of time whether we're going to need to put more money on a project or we're going to need to move funding on a project. The end goal would be able to provide a dashboard similar to what VDOT has, but just for our projects. So we can say, here's where they are in the LRTP, here's where they are in the TIP, here's where the RSTP CMAQ scoring was. Put all that information in one place that makes it easy for people to see what we're doing with the money and where these projects are. So those are the 5 areas from the staff side that we've identified. At this point, I'd like to welcome any feedback on those, and then also hear if you guys have any other ideas of areas you'd like to see that weren't mentioned here.
Hey, Miles, this is Tiffany. Under 5, is that where you would have some language addressing the situation for when maybe bids come higher than the kind of anticipated range? Because I know that's kind of a consistent issue when it comes to project delivery when the bids are higher than anticipated.
Yes, I think that would be handled under both the allocation section, where we talk about having a balance to be able to cover those, and then the bids coming in high, because that is usually the area where it's a quick need and we have to be able to address it it's a lot of creative thinking usually from Liz and Larry on that side of solutions that we can work on to identify other projects for transfers or some other solution. So yes, I think that would need to be built into this piece as well.
Miles, Tom Coleman, just a couple of really high-level, broad comments, and I'll probably be repeating these at some point in the future. From when it comes to the data-driven aspect as it relates to smart scale, certainly like the objectivity of that. But when I hear data-driven, I see dollar signs. Goochland's been very fortunate in that we've had some STAR studies and AMP studies that have provided some data for some applications. But for when we talk about data-driven, we're talking traffic studies and engineering plans and things like that for like, for example, a smart scale project that may or may not be funded. So it's a challenge for us to come up to fund those traffic studies and to fund those engineering plans for projects that may not come to fruition. And it's sort of related to that when it comes to leveraging. Again, high level, no concerns with leveraging. The logic makes sense. But like for Goochland, it took us a couple of years to come up with funds to leverage for a revenue share project. We don't have the funds to bring to the table to leverage. And certainly something like CVTA, which has a formula that's going to bring some funds to the table, that's something new that we'll be able to consider. We, for something like Smart Scale, which is competitive, or TA, which is competitive, and we may be moving to RSTP, we're talking about leveraging funds for projects that are competitive, which we don't know if they're going to get funded or not. So I'll be interested to see how that plays out as we move forward with this. And that would be a concern that I would have. For smaller locality, I think we'd be disadvantaged when we're talking about leveraging funds.
Yeah, and Tom, I came from Charles City, so I definitely understand these small, not having extra, additional funds or resources to leverage or to do the data-driven. I think the goal of having the rural localities involved in this is that you are able to give us that insight through this process. The intent is not to make this more burdensome on you. If the LRTP process that we're working on now is all going to be staff-driven. to the extent possible, we are going to try and keep it at a staff-driven for the data-driven process. So the application shouldn't be more complicated is kind of the vision that we have right now. But as we work through this, we'll definitely keep that in mind, making sure we're not putting extra on you that's making it so all the funding goes to the handful of larger localities.
And this is
Yeah,
Sharon.
I think,
Go ahead.
yeah, sorry, Sharon. Just quickly, I want to say that I think that we, as a staff, I mean, we are not guided by any one particular detail. We wanted to make this process universal so that we can start to use it and be more transparent to the public about how decisions are made. So if there's something as we move through the next few months and have these discussions, if there's a direction that this group wants to go in terms of, you know, maybe they're just spitball and maybe the rural communities have different standards that we're using, the partial MPO communities, I should say. Maybe that's something to consider. I mean, we don't want to overly burden anybody, but as Miles mentioned, our goal is not to make anything more burdensome on anybody. It's to use staff expertise to kind of fill out a lot of these data sets.
Sharon, it sounded like you had a comment as well.
Yeah, I think it's safe to talk. So this is Sharon, and I just wanted to make sure that to address studies. So so even before we get to the PE stage, somehow allocating some flexibility for studies. If it's, you know, I'm not sure which focus area that fits into, but maybe it's like maintaining more of a balance, depending on how far we program out the projects, just to give all the localities some time to maybe do some studies to help with any applications.
I'm sorry, I'm writing down all the notes for everything so we can put this together. So since Nicole's not here, Chet and I are taking the minutes too. So if it takes me a second to respond, I'm just jotting things down. But I think the studies, you know, I think that was very clear from our discussions with TAC as well, that funding for studies needs to be available and needs to be available sooner than whatever we're doing for project funding.
Yeah.
So I think that's something we'll definitely keep in mind as we move through this. And I think we have time to figure that out. So,
awesome. Thanks.
Are there any other concerns or comments on these 5 staff identified areas?
I'll make a comment. This is Joe. So I like the concept of objective ranking because it implies impartiality and fairness and equity. But at the same time, you know, there's no objective ranking program that I'm aware of that is just going to be the perfect machine that's just going to tell you exactly what projects you should be doing and not. So I think along the lines of what has been incorporated into Smart Scale, and I don't know how it's being applied, but there is an allowance for the human element to come into play. And so I think we need to be careful to consider that in any objective system that we come up with. The other area is trying to, if you take kind of these various types of project categories, I really struggle with trying to evaluate a transit project against a bike ped project, against a capacity project, against a bridge project. I mean, that's what they all seem to get lumped in together, and there's weightings and other adjustments. But I'm not even sure that this is everybody here at the county would be entirely on board with this. But the concept of suballocating the funding to these various categories of improvements, and then within those particular pots or silos, then you would evaluate Bridge Project A versus Bridge Project B versus C, and not be evaluating against, say, you know, a bike ped. So all the bike ped, they get lumped into a silo. There's X number of dollars that have been suballocated, and then those are scored and ranked. And from that pot of money, those projects are the ones that are selected and funded. I just don't see how you can develop a system that can really do a good job of looking at these really disparate types of projects and then somehow, you know, rank one against the other.
Sure. So I think with the sub-allocating to modes, we may run into the same problem with sub-allocating to jurisdictions, the way that the regulations are written. And it's not that we can't do it, it has to be justified through federal highways that we're doing it for a specific reason that is a prioritization reason. So it's not allowed, it is a few extra hoops we'd have to go through. The other option is like Hampton Roads has done, they have different weighting for the transit projects and the bike ped projects. So even though they're using the same general criteria, they have only, you know, say 200 points it's scored out of for bike ped projects as opposed to the 300 points that it's scored out of for highway projects. So they have a little bit of different scoring while still trying to maintain that objectivity. So I think we can definitely look at that direction as well as we move towards something objective of finding either different scoring or different ways that we can make sure that the projects are competitive, even though they're different types of projects. So
this is Tiffany. I was just thinking too that I think there's a challenge, and I know that we experienced this with the last long range plan of even discussing how much you set aside for each mode out of the different pots. So that would require kind of like a bigger discussion of where do you want to prioritize, you know, even over the next 6 years, what modes should get a certain amount of funding, which I don't know if, as a subcommittee, I don't know if I'm ready to have that discussion. I'm not even a voting member. So I think that there would be a little bit of a challenge for at least staff to be able to come up with numbers or levels to be able to allocate for different modes for funding.
Yeah, I think that's definitely been a challenge as we've already started looking into that for the LRTP this time. So I understand that concern, we'll acknowledge and, you know, make sure we note that one too. Are there any other concerns about these focus areas? If not, I'll move on to kind of the general tasks of how we're envisioning this project will go through as we do the update. Okay, seeing none, I'll just move on. So the scope of the update, we've basically broken it down into 4 tasks. So it's kind of looking at the guidelines as they're written today and different areas of what we need to work on. So task 1, this would be our next meeting. We'd be looking at just the general program overviews, the project screenings for applications. So this is where when we get the initial application, we look at consistency with federal regulations, cost estimates, schedules, and look at what we need to do on those to help improve some of those areas we were talking about before. And then the last piece is the Lrtp consistency. So with the new Lrtp, this advisory committee has okayed a new set of breakdown between regional and local projects. So it'd be using that workflow and how this would apply to our funding for these sources. The second task is probably the most difficult. It's the scoring and selection. So the way we're envisioning it right now, there would be scoring criteria that we can use for the RSTP and CMAQ program. So all of those projects would be scored similarly. Obviously, CMAQ has to reduce emissions, but we still want to further other goals that we're looking at with those projects as well. This second would be scoring for studies and programs. As I mentioned, we can't score those the same way just because of the nature of those types of projects. And then TA project scoring. And then the last piece would be prioritization. So moving towards a more objective process, prioritization could just be strictly based on score, or we could consider other elements like geographic balance or other elements like that. So that's a discussion we'll need to have for that task 2. Task 3 is the allocations. So right now we have an order of allocations in the guidelines. We obviously can review that, but we'd like to look into some of this other information as well. So our balance entry, the general philosophy or approach to allocating our funds, leveraging, how do we accomplish that? What kind of guidance do we want to give? Transfers, so transfers and advancing projects, depending on how we agree on the allocations, transfers and advancing projects become a lot more complicated. You know, if there's not a lot of balance left over, it's a lot harder to move money around. So we'd have to look into those as well in the logistics. We have some guidance right now from a MOU that we have with VDOT, but we can incorporate that into our guidelines here as well. Cost overruns, this is basically right now the way it's written, it's 10% or less, it goes to TAC. Anything above that, it goes through the whole TAC then policy board process. So revisiting that, seeing how we want to handle those. And then the reporting and tracking that I mentioned before. So seeing if there's a better way for us to be able to track this instead of sitting down with you each November to say, where are these projects at? Is there an easy way for us to keep it updated, you know, once a quarter, twice a year, something like that, so that we have better information in real time and we can make better decisions as we're moving forward. And then task 4 would be moving on to adoption. So basically what this would entail, there'd be a draft document prepared, reviewed by the subcommittee. The subcommittee would then take a formal vote. So this would be really the only time we'd be asking you to take a vote with a majority rather than a consensus approach. Then it would go to TAC, a public review period for 15 days under our engagement plan, and then go to the policy board. So those are the general scope of how we're envisioning this working. So those are essentially the 4 meetings that we'd have after this. Would be handling a task at each meeting. As needed, we could, you know, continue that and do a second meeting on a topic if, for example, scoring is particularly contentious and we need extra time. But the goal is to just move through this and get a general consensus from the 5 voting members with the input from our non-voting members, so that when we take it to TAC, we've already got essentially half of the committee is on board with it. So it'll be a much smoother process. So any questions about the general scope and the tasks as we've outlined them? Okay.
I do like the idea of, this is Sharon, that you mentioned twice now about being more transparent about what's going on with the projects and just like a simple update so everybody's on the same page and in the loop about the projects. That makes sense.
Thank you. Okay. So this was going to be just a short meeting since this is just our kickoff, but here's the proposed schedule for our future meetings. So this basically has our topic, the month that we're meeting, and then the action that we're requesting. So this month is just the kickoff, agreeing on this general schedule and scope. So far, I haven't heard any major concerns. It's some ideas of what we need to consider as we work through it, but we haven't heard anything that would derail this general approach. So next month in October, we would be doing that first section with screening and project eligibility. We'll have a few month break. There's 2 reasons for this really. We want to line it up with the LRTP as much as possible, and that's tentatively where we have the scoring discussion for LRTP to have concluded. So hopefully we'd be having those conversations at the same time. The other piece of it, I have a 2-week-old now, so I am planning to take off some time in between. So this will just work better for both the schedule and then for me as well. And then allocations, we'd handle those in February. So then basically the end of February, staff would have a draft for you, a completed draft. The subcommittee would make a recommendation in March. In April would go to TAC, and then by May we'd have it adopted for implementation for the next cycle, so for the FY23 funding cycle. And then just the general approach that we're planning to take for each of these tasks, what we're proposing is that staff will bring a draft of that section of the document to the meeting, and then it's more of responding elements that you don't like, what we need to change, rather than starting from a blank slate. So we'll just give you essentially staff's proposal for that criteria or that section, and then we can go from there on changing it, making sure we're addressing all the concerns. So does anyone have any questions or concerns about our proposed schedule for this?
No, Miles, Tom, I appreciate the staff y'all offering up those changes and giving us something to react to. I think that will get the ball rolling from the very start of the meeting. Appreciate that.
Okay, well, it sounds like we're good to go then on the schedule and the general approach that we're taking. So really the only other item that we had on today's agenda is figuring out the next meeting. So it's scheduled for October. I can either send out another doodle poll and we can pick a date, or we can try and pick one right now, whatever your preference is. So I'd like to hear from anyone here what you prefer on that. Might be easier with the poll if everybody doesn't have a calendar handy.
I can go either way. This is Liz.
Okay.
Doodle poll might be
I'm in
easier so
between both.
everybody can double check their schedules, but I'm fine doing it either way, but you might get more attendance with the doodle poll.
I vote for doodle poll as well.
Okay, well, I'll get that sent out then this week, and that way we can have the next meeting date on your calendars as soon as possible. But that's really everything that I had. Did anyone else have any other follow-up comments before we conclude this meeting and adjourn?
First, Miles, I'm sorry, Liz, really quick, congratulations. I had no idea.
Thank you.
Yeah, good luck.
Said from someone who knows, yes.
Congratulations, Miles.
Congrats. Oh, the only other thing I was going to ask, and this might be just an idea, is there any need to, like, mid-cycle, mid-year, do a total review of cost estimates, at least for active projects, maybe for where they're in the first year of the 6-year plan? I don't need an answer today. I'm just wondering if for the RSTP CMAQ process, if there is a need to do like a review of all the active project budgets mid-year. I don't care either way, just throwing it out there.
Okay. Well, that's something we can definitely look into. I mean, I think, Liz, your guidance on that's going to be crucial, because you've seen all of our overruns that we've had in the past couple of years.
Right.
So I think
that's exactly the thought process behind that, is that we could maybe mitigate some of that.
Well, I'll jot that down too for.
I'm open to that idea. This is Sharon.
Miles?
Yes.
This is Joe. So along the lines of cost estimates, this is a difficult one as well. I'm not sure that when we talk about cost estimates, we're all using the same starting point, if you will, because we'll submit an estimate with our application, and the VDOT process now is not to quote unquote lock that estimate in until you get a little bit further along into the design of the project. Mm-hmm. But even then, I think it's at like the 30% design stage. Even then, there are so many unknowns in the development of a project that it's a little bit more accurate than throwing darts at a board, but not too much more than that. And I'm not making excuses. I don't want to go on too far off base here, but utility estimates and right-of-way estimates are probably the most challenging. If you don't even know what you're acquiring, much less what they are appraised at, what do you do? So you come up with a budget number, and the as far as bidding goes, I mean, you're really kind of subject to the market. I won't say whims, but it's market based. Is what it is, and well, there you go. To use a phrase that's been used, it is what it is, and there's nothing that we are doing as designers and engineers that are really going to materially change that unless you really start getting into significant scope changes. It is what it is.
I think what we can do this next meeting, the cost estimating is one of the discussions. So I think this will lead us right into that. Staff has some ideas of what we can do, and we can bring that back, and then this group can weigh in and give us ideas on are there better ways to improve our cost estimating. So, but that is good to keep in mind, that we do have different, what we're looking at is different in terms of how everyone's doing it and where we are in the project as well.
Right. That was my main point. Yeah, how we do it is a challenge. It's always going to be a challenge as I see it.
I tend to agree with everything Joe said. Those are all valid concerns through the project development process, which kind of is another reason maybe a mid-year review of the first year projects might help. I mean, it's just, at least you're a little bit closer to the next phase that you're moving into.
Okay, well, I've taken notes on everything you guys have said so far. What we'll do is we'll try and incorporate that for our next task that comes up and subsequently as well. Are there any last comments before we go ahead and adjourn? Well, in that case, thank you all for coming to the kickoff meeting. I know this wasn't the most exciting. It was just a lot of getting through the basics, but I think the next few meetings are going to be very good, and we're going to have a lot of discussion, and I think we'll be able to make some positive changes to this program. So,
Miles, before everybody goes, I just want to say thank you to you guys. This is a huge undertaking, but as you mentioned, this million-year-old process, I think this is a really important process. So I appreciate you guys diving into this.
Thanks, Liz.
I agree. I think you did a great job kind of laying out the process. So thank you.